All right, welcome everybody to this episode of Beyond Geopolitics, where I'm very happy to be joined by my good friend Mike Robinson of the UK column. Mike, how are you doing?
I'm doing absolutely fine. Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, my pleasure. And we were just chatting on the phone and talking about some of the dangers and tripfalls that have been set up for many people who mean well, who want to have a good future right now, but we are in a systemic crisis, especially acutely concentrated across the transatlantic domain, but it's a world crisis. It has various manifestations, but one of those aspects of it, as we've seen with many crises throughout history, is that it's not entirely organic. Some of it, to a certain degree, there are supranational institutions manifesting and expressing power through three-letter agencies, through banking, through finance, and that have psychologically profiled the population, which has, I mean, the masses as a whole have a lot in common, a lot to work towards as far as if we could get our act together and have some concerted, common principled fight for solutions. There's a lot to be done, a lot to be built, and common enemies. And yet people seem to be more divided now than ever before. And whether it's in the United States, where not that long ago, Antifa, this very ambiguous radical left organization, but very ambiguous, has been defined now as a terrorist organization. We see, various Orwellian mandates coming into effect from conservative voices in the wake of the Charlie Kirk murder, especially, which is weird because these are typically voices who have resisted tyrannical imposition by government agencies against freedom of speech and what have you. There's things like the Charlie Kirk Act, which seems to be doing certain things that the COVID Gestapo was pushing back during the dark days of the pandemic, and also in the UK. There's the reverberations of what something that could become more and more violent. We had the Unite the Kingdom rally overseen by the figure of Tommy Robinson, who has a number of red alarms that should go up around him. So I'm just wondering, you and I were chatting a little bit about some of the dangers, the pitfalls that people need to look at. How are you thinking about this in general, and what sorts of concerns do you have about this world situation and how people are reacting to it?
I think the primary concern is, as you've just said, the three-letter agencies or whoever else is playing in the game at the moment
Mm,
are very good at creating or discovering what the real inflection points are in society and driving wedges in there. I am quite staggered actually about how, particularly since COVID, well, maybe it goes back a little bit further than that. Maybe it goes back to Brexit in the UK. People who would have considered themselves to be mainstream and middle of the road have been absolutely radicalized, and I'm not and radicalized in both sides of the political spectrum. I want to make it clear I don't subscribe to the idea of a political spectrum as such, but clearly lots of other people do identify themselves as being on the right or on the left. Um,
mhm.
but what we've seen in the UK, certainly I believe this has happened in the United States as well, is that people have been pushed extremely hard towards extremes. Now, if I think back to 2016, 2017 or so, uh, well, I should preamble this by saying that in the UK we have this anti-extremist policy called Prevent, which is a British government policy that supposedly is there to prevent people becoming radicalized. And it was originally built around the idea of Islamic extremism. And so anybody that was viewing themselves as being extremist in that camp would be referred to Prevent, and they would go into some kind of re-education system and so on, right? And what's happened, what I started to see in sort of 2016, 2017 time was discussion in the documentation around the Prevent strategy of a right wing extremism, a right wing extremist thread in British society, which basically didn't exist. It wasn't there. And so if they're starting to, I felt at the time that if they're starting to talk about uh, this in the documentation and it doesn't exist yet, then they must be about to create it. And then we had Brexit, and then we had the COVIDocracy, and then now we've had the whole migration issue. And at each and all the way through that, we've had this thread of censorship and injustice, and as a result, what we've seen is people being driven to the right, let's say, and an extreme right that didn't exist, and actually, I would argue that to a large degree it still doesn't exist, but still it has been the construct has been created, and people are being identified with that, whether they genuinely would fit into any definition of far right that you and I might be familiar with. That's how they're
Yeah.
being categorized, and that's how and to a certain degree, they are um, identifying themselves as being on the right of politics.
Yeah.
But equally, we've seen more and more radicalization over that same period on the so-called left of politics around LGBT issues, around trans issues, and all these have sort of fed into this massive division that's happened in society now, and it may have some foundations in sort of grassroots feeling, but that grassroots feeling has been amplified and grabbed by vested interests and is being turned into something quite different.
Yeah.
And where I see a real danger is, for example, us as the UK column, we're often accused on one hand of being right wing and on the other hand of being left wing. And actually, part of the reason is because people can't work out what we are, because we would argue against certain types of trans or LGBT literature appearing in school libraries on one hand, which would be viewed as a right wing uh, opinion to hold, but on the other hand, we're arguing against Israel's action in Gaza, which would be considered as a left wing viewpoint or a left wing position to take. So it becomes very difficult for people to work out what we are. And my feeling is that that's what we should all be. We should all be taking our positions on the issues rather than on whether an issue is associated with one sort of part of the political spectrum or not. And we shouldn't by default be saying, well, because I view myself as being on the right of politics, therefore I've got to believe in Israel, and therefore I've got to believe in X, Y, and Z. We should be, in my view, absolutely being a bit more sensible about how we look at what's going on in the world. But what I'm saying is that on both sides of the argument, there's an effort to attach specific issues to your position on the political spectrum, and people are being encouraged to take the package
Yeah.
and without question take the package, and no argument about it. And if you argue about a particular part of the package from somebody who might be considered to be a left wing or a right wing politician or a commentator, if you argue with them on one issue, then you get absolutely, you get your head ripped off by them and by their followers. So
Yeah.
so this, of course, all helps to radicalize. But the other thing that's helping to radicalize is the the absolutely intentional unfair treatment by the state of certain groupings of people, and that's helping to push people to extremes as well. So I think all this feeds into a very dangerous environment where people are becoming enraged. They don't really necessarily understand exactly why they're becoming enraged, and this is feeding into to large groups and large sections of society getting to the point of boiling point, and actually I see a real danger of significant civil unrest in the not too distant future.
Absolutely. No, that's very well said. And these very rigid formulaic categories are it's such a concern, because if you look at like the typical leftist, or somebody who would identify as a leftist, so-called, whatever that even means anymore, in the 1990s, it means something very different than today, 30 years, 25, 30 years later. where all of a sudden it's not enough just to be like pro labor, anti-imperialism, against war, which is typically, I think, what the John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, tradition of the democratic movement really, typically represented, and which people were still holding on to until not that long ago. But all of a sudden now, if you are against war, you're against genocide in Palestine, all of a sudden you are expected to also by default support all of the LGBT XYZ woke, brainwashing of children, and you have to take the whole package. And if you're going to be a conservative, well, it's not enough to simply support conservative values and the idea of not, encouraging kids to get their genitalia removed or anything like that. It's not enough just to have conservative moral values. You have to also support the state of Israel, no matter what they do. You have to necessarily be against immigrants. You have to really, really blame immigrants for all of our problems, and you can't think in a more nuanced way. So the idea of like thinking in a nuanced fashion has really been crushed. And you were bringing up to me the concern that you had looking at the UK case of Zora Sultana, who's somebody who's really trying to capture the voice of labor, and she seems very similar in so many ways to Zoran Mamdani in New York, or AOC, or a number of those leftists as well, who are increasingly both against Palestine, but also thus for Antifa. They're for the whole package, and that really gives more fuel, as you were pointing out, to the Tommy Robinsons out there, who are again trying to capture the sentiment of those who reject it. So it seems like a very, very formulaic thing. But could you say a little bit more about, because I wasn't really looking so much at Zara Sultana that much. Could you say a little bit more about the dangerousness of her role in taking what was formerly a pretty common sense movement led by people like Jeremy Corbyn and turning it into something more weaponized, and how that's playing into what Tommy Robinson is doing on the opposite
Well,
extreme?
yeah, just to take one example of one statement that she's made in the last couple of weeks, and that is
Mm.
to say that there is no room in her new movement, which is, as you say, there to capture a disaffected labor sentiment. There is no room in her new movement for people with socially conservative views. Now, a large part of the left in the UK has had socially conservative views. The left working class often have socially conservative views. So, in other words, if you want to support her and you want to, with her, be, against the genocide in Palestine, you've got to also accept the LGBT and trans situation. And many people on the left in this country naturally don't recognize or support that as, or recognize that as being something that they would be aligned with. That doesn't mean that they are suddenly Tories. So where does it leave people then? It leaves them either becoming, more radicalized in some of these other issues, or they're effectively out in the cold, not really belonging to
Right.
anything. But it absolutely is causing people to move in a particular direction. I think you were talking about AOC there, for example. Well, if we look at AOC and look at what she's been talking about over the last number of years, one of the really significant aspects of her position has been that anybody that disagrees with her should be silenced, and she's been a key driver of censorship, and or at least this censorship agenda. But suddenly, since Charlie Kirk, now we have the libertarian right saying we've got to shut people up, and that so the reason I think this is dangerous is because once people become pushed towards extremes, actually it becomes very difficult to tell the difference anymore with some of the key underlying talking points. If you take extreme, if we say historically extreme left wing might be represented by Soviet Russia, and we say that extreme right wing might be represented by Nazi Germany. Actually, what was the difference for the average person? You had, you know, concentration camps, you had extreme censorship, you weren't allowed to speak out or present any kind of opposition to the state. And we're already starting to a certain degree see that type of similarity in the positions of key spokespeople on both sides of this argument. And once we start to see the same kind of noises coming out of people that are supposedly at completely opposite sides of the political spectrum, this starts to look very dangerous and unpleasant.
Mm. And just as the work of Anthony Sutton pointed out back in the I guess this was the 70s or so, that Anthony Sutton was piecing this together, that Wall Street and London banks and financiers had a big role to play in both the growth of the Trotskyist Bolshevik operation on the one extreme, and then also the growth of National Socialism as a solution to the infringements on people's liberties, dignity that were caused by the Versailles debt repayments, also imposed by the same Milner operation then controlling England in the wake of World War I, which by design seems to have consciously destroyed economically the vitality of an already abused people of Germany, and then resulted in a radicalization as they were suffocated more and more, such that a fringe party that nobody thought was ever going to come within 10 miles of power all of a sudden became the dominant party by 1933, professing to offer dignity and a new renewal of the tribe, the tribalism of the conservative masses that were more and more radicalized as Hitler came to power. But again, the same, if you look at it from the standpoint of this top-down approach, you tend to see signs and patterns that resulted in disastrous effects historically of false left, false right dichotomizations, both kind of converging on the same kind of fascist dystopia. And we see similar patterns today. And you were bringing up to me that even when looking at the Unite the Kingdom rally, there were certain red alarms that were going up for you there too. Is there
Well,
anything you could speak to that on?
yeah, well, 2 points here. First of all,
Mm,
let's just talk a little bit about the pressure that's in the UK at the moment. So the
mm,
UK has seen its population rise, you know, astronomically in the last 10 years. We've got a population at the moment of what, 70 million people.
mm,
We were having basically the problem really started under Tony Blair, and there have been periods since 1998 where we've had a net million people coming into this country every year, right? We haven't been building homes, we haven't been building schools, we haven't been building hospitals, we haven't been building reservoirs, we haven't been building power stations, we haven't been building roads or
yeah.
railways, right? All these things have been in a state of varying
Decay.
degrees of collapse for the last
Yeah.
40 years, right?
Mm,
And so we have just in common with many other countries, we have a population problem of an aging population and collapsing birth rates. And so, you know, we can argue about what the motivation for the migration policy is. Um, let's just say, for the sake of argument, if we suspend our disbelief for a second, for the sake of argument, we need the migration in order to produce the working age, or to bring enough working age people into the country to keep the elderly in social care and so on. Nonetheless, that the rate of change, the rate of influx of people has created so much tension in society. Partly, and I mean largely, I would argue, it's not because people are fundamentally racist. I can see that there are racist feelings arise in people as a result of the pressure that they're feeling. But I don't think that the argument against migration is fundamentally racist. I think the issue is fundamentally that because the economic infrastructure has not been built to keep pace with the scale of the migration, that has all happened so suddenly that you can no longer drive from one city to the next without sitting in a traffic jam for 3 hours, or you can't get on a train because they're packed, or you can't find a house to
Yeah.
live in.
Yeah.
it's inevitable that this is going to cause tension in society. And
Or in many cases, ridiculously preferential treatment is being provided by the state to people coming in from a variety of countries.
100% right. So I was going to come on to
Yeah.
that because of course what
Mm-hmm.
you do is you create the pressure and the tension
Mm-hmm.
at that level, and then you start the unfair treatment. So you start accusing the white indigenous population of being racist. You start arresting them for saying things on social media. You treat people unfairly at the same time that you offer um, you know better and better benefits to people that are coming into the country, which then those benefits are not available to the people that have been here forever. So you create this sense of unfairness on top of the pressure, and that
Mm-hmm.
inevitably leads to an outpouring of feeling, and some of that feeling inevitably is going to appear on the surface to be fundamentally racist, which I don't think people in the UK are. So then what do you do? Then you start pumping in the money. And when we look at where the money is coming from, so Tommy Robinson has organized a rally which took place a couple of weeks ago, and there were varying numbers of people claimed to be at it. The mainstream press said 110,000. It clearly was not 110,000. Other people said it was 3 million. It clearly wasn't 3 million either. I think it was around the 800 to
Yeah.
1,000 to a million people. Okay. Uh, and that was ostensibly organized by Tommy Robinson. And of course, there are more and more really excellent videos starting to come out now, explaining where his funding has come from and so on. And without question, it's coming from Zionism, from the Israeli lobby, whatever you want to call it. But on the day of that event, there was a counter demonstration as well, and it was ostensibly organized by the unions. So there we already have the idea of a left-right split. So Robinson being on the right, and that's the right wing, and then the unions organizing this thing. But then when you look at the backers of the counter demonstration, what do you find? You find Jewish Zionist organizations. And so now we have Zionism funding both sides of the argument here, and that really should be raising major alarm bells in people, because that absolutely has the signs of some kind of deeper state operation at work here.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. Another thing that I noticed is that sometimes I give myself the liberty to go and get lost a little bit, or just get entertained by scrolling on Twitter, on X, just to get my endorphins, going in my brain for the next interesting little video of animals or whatever. And what I've noticed though is a pattern where X is very frequently feeding me emotionally intense imagery of immigrants doing very bad things. Very bad things. And I've noticed that a lot of people have had similar observations, is that there's like a nudging of especially conservatives who have been profiled as having conservative tastes, who are on social media, who are being whose emotions are being artificially amplified by suggestions that they never asked for, just showing them more and more examples of terrible examples of just immigrants being abusive and rape gangs and things like that. Um, you detect that? I know Elon Musk presented or spoke at the Unite the Kingdom event, has been pretty vocal, even proposing a new political party in America to, I think, capture some of the disenfranchised Trump supporters from the MAGA base into something new, maybe something more inclined to a dark MAGA psychological Jungian profile. I'm not too sure, to invoke or tap into the darkness that they've failed to tap into up until now. So do you detect a certain degree of social engineering, as I'm suspecting is going on right now? Is that something that's on your radar too?
No, 100%. And
Mm.
I've watching the rhetoric around the since the 7th of October, let's just take this as an example. Since the 7th of October, there have been regular pro-Palestine demonstrations in London, and one of the early efforts to get tension on the streets, to get some kind of clash on the streets, was a couple of what I believe were completely staged events where people that were ostensibly pro-Palestine were in somehow desecrating the cenotaph, which is the big memorial in London to the war dead that Britain has from particularly from the First and Second World War. And suddenly there was this big campaign came up from people on the right, including Tommy Robinson, saying we've got to protect the cenotaph and so on, and they were attempting to start counter demonstrations to the pro-Palestine demonstrations that were going on, and there was a definite effort to get people moving where they were not actually inclined to move at all. But the basic underlying incidents that caused this in the first place just looked completely staged to me.
Mm.
It's interesting that the pro-Palestine. I went to some of the pro-Palestine demonstrations, and there's no doubt that. Well, the first thing I'll say here is that those efforts, those original efforts, and actually many of the efforts between that time and in the last couple of years, failed to generate the angst that was necessary to get a real uprising against the Palestinian demonstrations, and they couldn't get this effort to pitch people against each other pretty much failed. But what's fascinating is that when we attended some of the early pro-Palestine demos, and I have to say, in general, they were immigrant faces that you were seeing at those demonstrations. Not that many people that were sort of white British at those. And that was pretty much the case until the UK government prescribed Palestine Action.
Mm.
And so they effectively labelled Palestine Action. This was a campaign group that was going around carrying out direct action activities. So it culminated in. I mean, they were running demonstrations outside Elbit Systems, for example, which is one of the big Israeli arms manufacturers and suppliers, and that was causing problems. But it really came to a head when they invaded RAF Brize Norton, which is an RAF base in England, and spray painted some Royal Air Force aircraft with paint, and that was the limit as far as the British government was concerned. And so they prescribed them and labelled them as a terrorist organisation. They're no more terrorist than you or I, Matt. And so they in fact they put some of those people in prison on remand, and they've been on remand for many months, and their court case is only going to come in the next couple of months. So and their treatment has not been good in prison either. So they've been sitting in prison without charge, effectively, or without any kind of judicial process up to this point.
Yeah.
But what was fascinating about it was that once that organization was prescribed, the act of prescribing them was the trigger for many more ordinary white middle class professionals to get up off their sofas. And what we saw over the last few weeks was big demonstrations in London with large numbers of people being arrested because of course it's under the terrorism legislation. It's supposedly illegal in this country to be seen to be promoting a terrorist organization, and so something like around 1,000 people have been arrested so far on the basis that they were supporting Palestine Action, but they were generally older, white, professional, and this is something quite different. So I think that there are on the face of it, it might look like there were a guts of 1 million people out on the streets because
Hmm.
Tommy asked them to come out on the streets. I don't think that's what happened at all. I think there were 1 million people out on the streets who were concerned about what's happening in the country, and felt the need to demonstrate about that. But I think that actually, if we were to look at what proportion of people in the UK, no matter what side of the political spectrum they're on, are um, against what Israel is doing in Gaza at the moment, it's the majority of people in the UK are absolutely against that. And so what we're saying is, as I said, is this Zionist money attempting to drive opinion here, but I'm not sure that it's working. I think that there is undoubtedly still a lot of anger. People are at boiling point on many issues, and I think it's a very dangerous time because I think it's not going to take too much to trigger them. But
Hmm.
I'm not sure how far along. I'm not sure that people's willingness to actually get to the point of civil unrest is as far along as maybe the organizers are hoping.
Yeah, I get the sense that there's some wannabe game masters trying to play humanity like a board game and
Right.
pushing on the accelerationist button right now to try desperately to push people to the brink and beyond. Um, but human beings aren't a board game. We're not pieces that you could just move around. Although some video game programmers out there who think like gods might believe differently. It's more difficult, though. Again, not impossible, as we've seen throughout much of human history, to get human beings who don't understand how to introspect on where the causes of their convictions come from. Those types of people who don't take the time to do that do tend to be more weaponizable and work against their own best interests in the broad scheme of things. Um, you brought to my attention that one of those buttons that are being pushed on emotionally, by Tommy Robinson especially, but we have similar things in the United States, are the rape gangs. I mean, this is a feed I'm getting a lot in Twitter, on Grok, on X, is the pushing on the rape gang issue, which is certainly horrifying. But you were making the point to me that this is a symptom or a subsection of a much broader issue that has been going on for decades of rampant child abuse, human trafficking, other things. Maybe you could speak a little bit towards putting some nuance to that issue as well.
You know, January is going to be the 20th anniversary of the UK column,
Mm,
and aside from the sort of journalism part of what we do, something one area where we have directly engaged with people and helped drive a little bit of activism is with respect to child abuse, and we are very familiar with how that one of the reasons is because, of course, that is, as we know from Epstein, that is one of the main mechanisms for encouraging people that reach certain levels of society to take certain paths. So let's be clear about it. Blackmail is a very key tactic in getting people to do certain things.
mm,
And so, you know, one point I would make here is that the abuse of children has been at the core of the British establishment for a very long time. You know, this at least one prime minister, Edward Heath, is well known to have been. But if we look at Mountbatten as well, and a whole bunch of other people at the core of human of British society. One name that you may or may not be familiar with is Jimmy Savile, and he was a BBC radio DJ and then a BBC television presenter who managed to find himself interfacing with very young teenagers or younger children in
mhm,
his professional life. Um, and but then, as time went on, he started getting given other jobs as well. And so, for example, he ended up being through because of his supposedly because of his charity work, he became personal friends with then Prince Charles, now King Charles. He he ended up going for Christmas dinner with Margaret Thatcher every year. Uh,
mm,
he he ended up effectively. having free reign of a number of different hospitals around the country, particularly children's hospitals.
He
And
was
at
he was
some point,
knighted. He was knighted too, right?
yes, and at some point he was given the keys and was put in charge of Broadmoor Mental Prison. Now this was the top high security prison in the UK that held and still holds the worst rapists, murderers, mass murderers. This is where they send the serial killers. And you've got to say, you ask the question, why, what possible influence, why was this man involved with these at this level of society? He was, as I say, personal friends with the king. And then, subsequently it became obvious that he was not only an abuser himself. In fact, he was worse than that. He was a necrophiliac. He was using his access to hospital and hospital morgues to entertain himself. That's how dark this man was. But it became obvious that he was also procuring children for others and for including politicians. And did that include the royal family? Well, I don't know the answer to that. But then we've got the royal family directly involved with Epstein, and Ghislaine Maxwell spending time at Windsor Castle, where Trump has just been, and they were there often. So the absolute core of British society has been wrapped in this darkness of child abuse forever, and we have supported many of the survivors of this over the years. So we have direct knowledge of it from the horse's mouth, as the saying goes. So whenever the issue of the Asian grooming gangs story broke, we absolutely said, well, yes, okay, that is absolutely something which needs to be investigated and prosecuted. But there are questions around it. First of all, what proportion of the overall problem is that? But the other big question is, why was that particular issue allowed to happen? Why were these kids being taken away from foster care? Effectively, kids that were being supposedly looked after by the state, being taken into these grooming gangs to be abused. How did that happen? What was the mechanism? And of course, it happened with the full support of the local authorities, with the social services, with the police. They tried afterwards to justify it by saying, "Well, we didn't want to be called racists, so we didn't." And of course, that is an absolute nonsense explanation, because if a criminal act has taken place, it's a criminal act, whether the person that committed it is Asian or British or white British or from Caribbean or Africa or wherever. It doesn't matter. You prosecute them, and so this was an excuse. What has happened then is that issue has been used to absolutely drive anti-Muslim feeling in the country, because it's being presented as being something different to what's happening in
Yeah,
other
it's like
places.
being
And
rebranded, right? It's like taking this transgenerational systemic issue and then rebranding it to become something that is purely a Muslim issue caused by immigrants who just want to take in our children and our women and hurt them and abuse them. And it's really nefarious how that's being reframed in so many people's minds without who are losing track of the fact that no, this is, like you said, it's been going on. You brought up Lord Mountbatten, the systemic rapist and child molester going back to his days, probably way before even his running of India, where he developed a sick reputation, but it went on into Ireland and beyond. That's tied to the highest echelons of power today, and hundreds of thousands of children are just missing coming into the United States over the last few years alone, with untracked, no follow up. So there's an organized infrastructure in place that must be getting protection from very high up, top down institutions, three-letter agencies, and other things, both baked in within the government and in the shadow government, but that's working together to keep this thing going. And people are not addressing this properly, who could be otherwise. We could be looking at what Seville represented. This guy, but he mentored the king. He this is not a little thing. This should be really, really talked about.
Well, and the other thing is that when Jimmy Savile was eventually discovered and there
Mm.
was an attempt to bring a court case, the person in charge of the Department for Public Prosecutions at the time was Keir Starmer. So,
No.
right, right. So now Keir Starmer has always denied that he took any part in the decision not to prosecute Jimmy Savile, but nobody believes that.
Mm.
He was, and in any case, at the end of the day, he was the director of public prosecution, so he was in charge, and he carries the can ultimately. So, but nobody is answering any questions. But Savile is just one example. It's just one
Hmm.
example.
Hmm.
Edward Heath used to take kids out on his yacht, and they disappeared for a couple of days, and that was his entertainment. This kind of thing is baked into British society at that level. This is how we have from time to time on the UK column shown actually a piece of BBC video where they're interviewing the chief whip of the Tory party. I think this was actually Edward Heath's chief whip, a guy called Fortescue, and he's just openly talking to the BBC about how, as the chief whip, his role was to make sure that MPs followed the government line and so on,
Mm.
and that MPs would find themselves in some kind of trouble, sometimes involving small boys. He said to the BBC, and we would solve the problem for them because we
Of
knew that after we had done that, they would do anything we asked. And that we,
course.
we show that clip from time to time. It's been an open secret in this country for decades, and
Mm.
nobody is prepared to grip it. Nobody is, but when as soon as the narrative goes that it's somebody with brown skin, then at that point it becomes an issue. And of course, that's amplified by the media, whereas the media has absolutely persistently downplayed the institutional child abuse that's happened, uh, you know, at an institutional level amongst other demographics. And one of the issues that we have in this country is that the statistics for the demographics of who's actually committing abusive acts are not held. So basically anybody can make anything up about that. And one of the narratives that's been amplified is that there's a higher incidence per 100,000 population of Asians compared to other demographics in the country. Well, that's a lie because nobody actually knows that. That's been made
When
up. So
you're saying Haitians, right?
Asians, people from
Asians.
Asia. Yeah,
Asia.
so
Okay,
that
yeah.
be
All right.
the Asian is the term that's often used in the UK for people from the subcontinent, so India or Pakistan or Bangladesh,
Okay.
that neck of the woods
Gotcha.
would
Gotcha.
be described as being Asian in this country. Sorry, yes, I should have
Okay.
clarified.
And this is really not, and that's shocking that the actual statistics are not even properly addressed. That even what we're seeing as numbers is not even approximating the reality of what the issue is in real life. That's shocking to me that we don't have proper statistics of child abuse and other things of that sort. Um, and I just want to share, like, in some of my research, especially on the theosophy occult networks of the 19th century, it became more apparent that this is not a new thing either. Like W.T. Steed, a promoter of Cecil Rhodes, the Rhodes vision of renewing the British Empire, but also closely tied into Madame Blavatsky's esoteric section of Theosophists, sort of the spiritual warfare operation of the Anglo-Americans back in the 1870s, 80s, 90s. He was also a big promoter of parapsychology. His Borderlands and Pall Mall Gazettes were often promoting this sort of weird pseudoscience. But he was caught red-handed, trying to procure like a 12-year-old girl for sexual reasons. And there was a sting operation back in like 1890 something. And this guy is not a little, he was training William Randolph Hearst in government by media. Um, so this guy, he's a very, very high up figure. He, pioneered investigative journalism. But he got caught in a sting operation trying to procure a child for sex, and was adept enough because he controlled all of the media at the time that when he was in court, he decided to flip the narrative and begin to act like he was actually testing the London police and said, I condemn the London police because they were not doing their job in this rampant child sex trafficking, and I have exposed it. And all of his press outlets began to promote this common narrative. And before you know it, within a few months, he became a hero, who got the age of consent, raised from like, I don't know, 11 to 14 or something like that. But all that to say, it was putting a spotlight, or that there was rampant child trafficking even then going on, and probably from time immemorial by the elites, as part of just the way the machinery works. So it's not just a new thing that's been going on well over a century ago. Um, you were telling me a little bit though. We've been brushing up on Ireland, and so both the intelligence agencies behind the corruption of the leadership of society, maintaining a culture of corruption, of terror, but also schisming the population to destroy itself, to cannibalize itself. Ireland was a place that had been a thorn, a pain in the ass for the British Empire for a long time. And I remember you were talking a little bit about some of the operations that were done to undermine the authentic resistance, anti-imperial movements of Ireland, the Republican movements in the 1950s and 60s, especially. Can you speak a little bit about that and its parallels to today's strategies for like the strategy of tension that's being renewed again today, and how it was innovated under people like Lord Mountbatten and others back in the 60s in Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, I was born the year that the so-called Troubles in Northern Ireland started,
Mm,
and grew up with that as just being a part of life. Um, but I have to admit, I think I said this to you the last time we spoke, but the sort of the events which led up to the bringing in of the British Army in 1969, I'm not familiar enough with. I should be more familiar with what actually led up to that. But what came with the British Army in 1969 was General Sir Frank Kitson, which is a name
mm,
that I know you're familiar with, and because of the Mau Mau in Kenya, and also what he did in Malaya, and he also pulled the same kind of operation in Northern Ireland, and he wrote a number of books on sort of, well, the one that jumps off the tongue straight away is Gangs and Countergangs, and everybody should read that and try get an idea of the kinds of tactics that the British Empire applied to anywhere that it went. Actually, Matt, an Irish thinker that we both know about called John Waters has just published an article on his Substack. His Substack's called John Waters Unchained, and it's called How British Intelligence Planned the Irish Troubles of 1968 to 1998, and used Provo, that's short for Provisional IRA, fake patriots to achieve the ruination of Ireland. And so it's kind of in two parts. The first part is that part, and that's written by someone called Patrick O'Carroll. And then John himself, at the end of that article, talks about his experience with Sinn Féin in recent years, and it is a feature of nationalist slash Republican political parties in the last lot of years that they have, rather than being nationalist, have become internationalist, and this applies to the Scottish National Party. It certainly applies to Sinn Féin, and John Waters is commenting on this. So two articles on one page that I think are really worth reading, because the first one is talking about some of the manipulations that went on in order to create, effectively a pilot for a strategy of tension type operation. It happened to be in Northern Ireland, and it went on for 30 years. But then subsequent to that ending with the so-called Good Friday Agreement was a sort of transition of Sinn Féin from being a Republican party that represented the IRA and represented republicanism and the idea of United Ireland to something which is pro-immigration, pro-LGBT, pro internationalist policies, pro World Economic Forum, for example. It's something that looks quite different to the way it looked 30 years ago. And so and you got to ask, how did that happen? And John Waters is suggesting that, amongst other things, one or two imports to the party, female in particular, that had certain type of leadership training, have helped to drive this, and that was the same in the Scottish National Party as well. So it's interesting how something that stood for something which was, a united Ireland and had a clear political aim has been completely diverted into another direction, and seems to have managed to bring most people along with it. I'm not entirely sure how that works. Maybe you could say something to that, but it's a fascinating aspect of humanity that people that were engaged on a particular political for a particular political goal have just been swept along by on a wave of internationalism that seemed to just creep in as if without anybody particularly noticing.
Yeah, no, it is wild to see it. I mean, say what you will. I mean, I think we're both a little bit suspicious about Jerry Adams in general, but the character of Sinn Fein up until 2018 had a certain bite to it, a certain character that um is strangely absent over the last 7 or so years, as it's become this weird establishment globalist institution, which is very, very far removed from the Republican aspirations at its origins. And it just shocks me when you look at some of this history of the Irish Republican movement from the 18th century, where many of those leading Irish revolutionaries in the 1790s, 1798, 99, who tried valiantly, though failed to achieve what was achieved in the United States. Many of those Irish leaders were themselves participants in the American Revolution and tried to bring in their experience into Ireland, though again, British and Orange Order Masonic operations were much much more, I think, sophisticated than many of them wanted to believe, and so it didn't last long. But there was still this aspiration that at different moments came alive, and we saw the allies of Abraham Lincoln a century later emerge in Ireland, followers of Henry C. Carey, like Arthur Griffith, who helped set up the IRA when they had a very concrete idea, a very solid idea of nation building, of applying the principles of the sovereign nation of the Constitution for protectionism, productive credit for the improvement of the living standards of people. Um, and we saw it again, we saw it get infiltrated again by forces within the British Foreign Office, within Scotland Yard, that was able to radicalize, send in provocateurs back in the 1890s to undermine it, leading up to World War I, and then to sort of radicalize, dismantle it, cause it to have internal discord and internal chaos, that removed its teeth. But again, there's like moments, little bursts in the 20s with the Irish Free State movement that produced a certain amount of progress in opposition to the League of Nations orientation. But even that, it's like none of these more sane, healthy revolutionary tendencies are long lasting. There's, I think, a short-sightedness and an underappreciation of the sophistication of evil, of like the Frank Kitson quality of evil, or the Mountbatten quality of evil, that is really what we're up against. People don't want to think about it. They just want to be good. They want to get that emotional effect of getting justice now. And because of that, they always walk into traps, and they always find, whether it's COINTEL in the United States, right? As soon as you lost the leadership of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., and the leadership wasn't there anymore, those who could have known better, should have known better, found themselves welcoming in FBI provocateurs and agents into civil rights movements that were then increasingly radicalized in the United States. We saw similar patterns emerge throughout all of Europe, Ireland being no exception. And then these organizations that meant well at the start are just become instruments of chaos. They become instruments increasingly of violence if they don't self-cannibalize first, but then they become instruments that then justify increased state backlash to provide security to a population that becomes terrorized, right? We've seen that now in modern days around, obviously we've seen the wicked summer of 2020 after George Floyd was killed and something like 30 people were killed across the United States. Cities were burned, billions of dollars of damage for leftist backlash. But now we're seeing, I mean, the same pattern I'm seeing possibly there. There's certainly a lot of influencers who have strange military intelligence connections all of a sudden appearing on so many podcasts at the same time. Many, promoting this idea that if the population, the conservatives, want to get their dignity back, they have to tap into their crusader warrior ethos and prepare to fight, to kill or be killed for the sake of your tribe, of your great, the greatness of your English speaking nation or whatever. And is the enemy the intelligence agencies, the oligarchy that's been actually manipulating us all these years? No, it's the immigrants who are suppressing us, whether it's Nick
Yeah.
Fuentes or, I mean, I'm hearing other things coming from other special forces operatives as well, who are seen as all of a sudden champions of liberty. And you're like, no, you're promoting a new crusade. What are you doing? This is like, it smells a lot like 1920s Germany or 30s Germany, even increasingly. Um,
Absolutely. Look, I would just make the point here, Matt.
yeah.
We are a little bit older. We've been around the block a bit. We've seen this whole thing develop because we've lived it
Mm,
to a certain degree. Um, you're just talking there about the number of influences there. I can't remember what the figure was, but the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, for example, uh, claimed a couple of years ago to have something like 50,000 influencers on its books. If you've got one think tank with that degree of reach, right? What chance does the average person have that didn't live what we lived through and didn't see the development of the internet and didn't see how narratives have been developed over the last 20 or 30, 40 years, right? I do not envy somebody who maybe was living in a mainstream bubble for all their lives until the COVID thing happened, and suddenly they woke up and now they're looking around and they're looking for answers. And where the hell do they go to find the answers? Because they're being bombarded with information from all directions, and most of it is junk.
yep.
And so it is so easy to see how it is possible to drive opinion and drive. And everybody applauded when Elon Musk took control of Twitter, and the absolutely draconian one-sided censorship regime was scrapped. But what's been replaced with? You hinted at this earlier in our discussion. The amplification and the promotion of tweets that don't provide a link back to a source for the claim that's being made in the tweet, and that naturally means that the tweets that are getting amplified are the ones that are generally rubbish. They're wild speculation, or they're simply wrong, or and I do not envy people that are new to this game or don't have the experience to deal with it, because I can see how their emotions are driven, and somehow people have got to be convinced to just take a step back and start looking around at who are the players on the board, who's actually saying what, and what is their background, and try to somehow get a handle on whether a piece of information that's been presented to them is something which was designed in the first place to encourage them to react in a particular way. And certainly the first alarm bells should be ringing if we see something that gets us riled up inside. If it's turning our stomach in knots, the first thing to do at that point is to say, oh, right, okay, let's take a step back and actually consider what I'm being shown here.
Yeah. If you see something, say something to yourself. and think about
Yes.
reacting emotionally or supporting Orwellian dystopia. So, Mike, this is I think very good. It's a very I really appreciate this hour. I think we used it well, and I think that if people really take to heart the lessons that you have laid out and just the anomalies to be aware of, both historically and in the present, we will do well in avoiding the pitfalls and minefield of epistemological traps that have been set up to radicalize, to make us become our own worst enemies, and to justify ultimately the thing that we don't want, which is, an end to civilization in a prolonged dark age, which I believe we can overcome. But we have to be aware of these aspects of ourselves, the fallacies, the foibles of the human condition that the oligarchy knows. And you've done a great job with UK Column at bringing to the light for so many years. So thank you, Mike. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Beyond Geopolitics.